The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Hello and welcome to Squawk Box. We're coming to you live from London and Paris following another momentous night in French politics. These are your headlines.
France's left-wing coalition claims a shock victory in the parliamentary vote, holding off the far right, which came in a surprise third position.
France wakes up to a hung parliament with no clear indication of who will lead the government, as Prime Minister Gabriel Attal says he will step down.
The euro falls and the bond futures actually fall as well this morning as traders start to digest the outcome of the French election, fearing higher deficits and more spending.
U.S. unemployment breaches the 4% mark for the first time in 3 years, but June's jobs figure comes in hotter than expected at 206,000.
Another eventful weekend in politics, this time in France, where the left-wing group, the New Popular Front, has achieved a shock victory in the second round of the parliamentary election, thwarting the far-right National Rally, which had been expected to come first in the runoff vote. The NFP is set to pick up 180 seats, with Macron's centrist ensemble coalition coming in second with 158 seats. Now, Marine Le Pen's far-right bloc is seen taking only 143 seats. That is well below the up to 220 it was projected to win following the first round. Well, the result leaves no party with the majority and France with a hung parliament, potentially putting the country in a state of political paralysis. The parties are set to begin discussions to form a coalition government with an outright majority or, failing that, a minority government. The left wing says it expects to lead the next parliament, whatever form it takes, to carry out its heavy progressive tax and spending programme. Speaking to cheering crowds following the first exit poll, left-wing France Unbowed leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon called on President Macron to appoint a new Prime Minister from the New Popular Front. He insisted the bloc will enter parliamentary talks from a position of power and not simply continue carrying out Macron's agenda.
The President has the power. The President has the duty to call on the New Popular Front to govern. It is ready. The New Popular Front will respect the mandate according to the votes cast for its candidates. Our given word will be respected. The New Popular Front will apply its manifesto. All its manifesto and nothing but its manifesto.
National Rally leader Marine Le Pen said the results would lead to deadlock.
France will be totally blocked with three groups that have more or less the same influence in the National Assembly. We are losing one more year of unregulated immigration, one more year of losing purchasing power, one more year of a blowing up of insecurity in our country. But if we need to go through that, then we'll go through that.
Prime Minister Gabriel Attal announced he will hand in his resignation to President Macron this morning. He said the new parliament will get to work to address the needs of voters.
A new era also starts for the values that our candidates represented. We will need to invent something new, something great, something useful. To do so, we have to not be afraid of anything in question. From tomorrow, our political space should get to work to build a new political offer, to think always and above all of the French, of their lives, and to personify hope for them once again.
Now, voter turnout in Sunday's runoff election is expected to reach around 67%, according to Ipsos. That would be the highest since 1997 and well above the 46% registered just 2 years ago. So all eyes will, of course, be on that euro dollar. 108.27 is where we're currently seeing it. The euro slipped then, with French bond futures, of course, falling after those elections did point to a hung parliament, then casting pretty much fresh uncertainty over markets as a period of what looks like gridlock is anticipated then to loom.
Let's move out to Charlotte. We've got our reporters standing by, and Charlotte is in Paris with more. Charlotte, it was a big gamble from President Macron. The outcome was not quite what the market had expected here. We're now talking about the left rising to the top of politics, but potentially not with any majority to govern. So what does this mean in terms of Macron's gamble? Does he rule by division? Is it a delay to the far right coming to power later on? Or does it suggest there's more power, more momentum behind the left? Just walk us through the wash-up here.
Well, look, just 4 weeks ago, I was standing here after President Macron called this snap election after the far right made these huge wins in the European election. And he said, look, this calls for a moment of clarification for the country. Do they want the far right in power or not? And to a certain extent, we had this moment of clarification. France voted against the far right once again. And it was kind of a big shock result there, because the far right not only was beaten and didn't reach an absolute majority, they came third. And that was really, really unexpected. None of the polls has showed this scenario. So very interesting there to see that the Republican front, as they called, held. And that's because, as we discussed a lot last week, a lot of candidates dropped out of the race between the first round and the second round in order to just consolidate the anti-far right vote. And that worked. Certainly people voted for the non-far right candidate. Now, the clarification also makes things more complicated on another aspect, because, as you were saying, things look very complicated now. No bloc has a majority or anywhere reaching an absolute majority. The left-wing bloc coming in the lead around 180 seats, so very, very far from the 289 seats that you need for an absolute majority. President Macron's bloc actually held quite well, much better than expected, at around 170 seats. But here again, hard to see how they can reach an absolute majority, even if they make an alliance with the centre-right. For example, les Républicains, they're still far away of the magic number to reach a majority. So we have to wait and see. Some people are talking about coalition, certainly not in the French political tradition, unlike what we see in Germany, for example. And we heard from a lot of political leaders, including Jean-Luc Mélenchon from Les Insoumis, saying he will absolutely not negotiate with Macron's camp. So we have to wait and see what that means going forward. There'll be some discussions between the parties where they can put on the table, but certainly at the moment it looks like a hung parliament, and very difficult to say who could be prime minister going forward. Normally it's the head of the biggest group in the National Assembly, but at the moment it looks very unclear who could that be from the left-wing bloc, who could be the prime minister for that bloc, and would that be supported in parliament as well. So a lot of uncertainty out there. We have to wait and see what happens. President Macron last night saying that he's waiting for a structuration of National Assembly, basically saying waiting for the parties to figure out whether they can make a coalition or an agreement or not. Marine Le Pen saying that the result last night was disappointing, but that the far right's victory was only delayed. And that's what's at stake here. The next big election is the presidential one in 2027. The far right was hoping to use a victory in this parliamentary election as a stepping stone to the presidential one. Certainly now it looks like the things might be complicated, but a hung parliament, a chaotic National Assembly could still pave the ground to a far right win in a couple of years. So the centrist parties here have a big responsibility. The French voters did come out in mass, as you were saying, a record turnout, 67%, very hard, the highest in many years. But certainly now we have to see the centrist parties come together and put some options on the table, because at the moment it's a hung parliament, which for the market was the least bad options. What we heard, whether it was a far left or far right majority, was bad news for the market. Hung parliament was the least bad, but certainly there are still a lot of issues that need to be addressed for France, including public finances and a lot of reforms that need to be done. And if there's no majority in parliament, it will be very hard to address these issues.
Charlotte, I want to weigh in with what happened to the far right, because understanding what went wrong for them here is quite instrumental to what happens in future. And there was a feeling that despite Jordan Bardella having a very friendly face to the market, and Marine Le Pen as well, that perhaps the field of candidates for the far right was still somewhat of a toxic lineup, given some of the statements some of the candidates had made in recent weeks and months. What comes next? Because you and I have been standing in various different positions in France over the years, and it feels like every time the far right gets knocked down, they come back even stronger in a couple of years' time. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, look, let's not make a mistake here. The far right had their best result ever in the National Assembly. They still have above 140 MPs. They had 89 in the previous parliament. So they are making gains. Certainly, they didn't become the biggest bloc in the National Assembly, but they are still a force to reckon with, no doubt about that. They're the third political force in the country. And so, as you were saying, they had a lot of candidates that were not quite ready. Again, it was a snap election, a lot of candidates. They had to pick any candidate that was happy to sit in the different constituencies. A lot of them had some very controversial comments, etc. So that probably paid a little bit in the campaign. But you know, the Republican front is really what worked here, with the parties coming together and just removing their own candidates in those three-way races. And people came in mass voting here again. But what we know from this cordon sanitaire on this Republican front, that has been slowly and gradually fizzling out in the different elections, and it has held. Before how long? That really is the question. And here again, the centrist parties will hold a huge responsibility now in putting some maybe new way of doing politics. Whether that's a coalition, we'll have to wait and see. But certainly there is a discontent with politics and the way they have been done until now. So a new way has to come on the table, and it's very unclear to see how that could be, and that could still be a fertile ground for the far right going forward.
Charlotte, I mean, there were conversations just before this all happened in that President Macron was calling this so that he could have the far right perhaps in some sort of leadership position, see how chaotic it is, and hopefully at the next election in around 3 years' time, the world would see that actually this is not the way to go and vote the other way. It hasn't worked out that way. What does this mean for the balance of power within the French parliament?
Certainly, that doesn't play in President Macron's camp favor. They have lost many seats. They have lost almost 80 seats compared to the last parliament. So they are a wounded force, and certainly they were the biggest group in parliament. They are not anymore. They're only the second largest one. So the force and the dynamic is certainly on the side of the left-wing bloc. But the left-wing bloc have their own issues. They did come together very, very quick in this snap election, and no one expected that, including President Macron. They did come together. They did put an economic program together. But there are still a lot of tensions within that group, and that's what can be really the biggest dynamic here, is that between La France Insoumise, the far left bloc, the socialists and the Greens, they have different views on what Europe should be, on many, many things. And so that's why they can't even agree on the prime minister name, because they don't agree on the name. So that's the conversations that they have within that group. So we know that they had tensions in the last parliamentary election, and that group imploded. Now they really committed to this alliance. We have to wait and see whether they can commit to that. And bringing a name for prime minister would be the very first challenge.
Charlotte, I want to ask you about the left and what the policies look like, because some of them seem fairly market unfriendly in terms of higher taxes, spending measures at a time when we know the market is very fixated on finances and whether a country is on a sustainable pathway. Just what do those policies look like? What could scare the market, and what is likely to even progress from here?
But what we heard from Jean-Luc Mélenchon yesterday when he spoke just after the exit polls is that he said he would do no negotiations with any party, and that he was here to apply the whole and full political manifesto of the Nouveau Front Populaire. And as you were saying, this manifesto is a very expensive one economically, and in a way the market was almost more worried about that economic program than the far-right one. And look, you have some very respected economists behind the left-wing bloc economic program, but as you were saying, an expensive one that wants to put a lot of new taxes on, including a wealth tax, a transaction tax. They want to bring all this back on the table. And they say that's the way for them to reboot the French economy, to redistribute better and kickstart the French economy. It's controversial. It's an expensive economic program. It would bring the debt to close to 120% by 2027, according to some economists. But they're still sticking to their guns. And they say this is why the country needs now. So the markets might be a little bit worried to see that potentially the left-wing bloc could be the ones putting forward a government. But again, because they're very, very far from an absolute majority, they would not be able to implement the economic program in full at all.
Charlotte, thank you very much for spelling it out for us. Huge ramifications, I think, for the audience. There were reports suggesting that tax advisors, lawyers, wealth managers were inundated with calls ahead of the French election about a week out, just asking whether the money was safe in France and whether they need to make contingency plans. So today now, with the far left government that we're talking about here, and depending on what type of power they have in these talks that are taking place in the backdrop and the ability to push forward any policy, it does have potentially huge fallout for that money if it's still invested in France.
Yeah, and I mean, it's probably because just before this election, those calls would have ranged on saying, well, we see the far right as being the main issue at play here, and these are the ones we should perhaps worry about. And all the permutations may have been mapped out when it comes to that. And then to have the stunning swing towards the far left, essentially, in all of this kind of gives a different picture. And you can imagine that the calls will come through even today, just being inundated with understanding what exactly does this mean, especially then for foreign policy. Because, I mean, while there might not necessarily be the overt chance, there are question marks around whether Jean-Luc Mélenchon would actually become prime minister.
Yeah.
Even if he isn't, that swing towards that end could mean a scuppering and a stifling of President Macron's presence even in Europe.
Yeah, there's the foreign policy implication. But I think even domestically, you've had so many entrepreneurs that have been encouraged to go to France. And Brexit, of course, encouraged some of that money as well. But there's been a very big program around tech entrepreneurs. And that money that has been made almost overnight, is it safe if you've got wealth taxes and some sort of a pushback on higher taxation policy? But we're going to have a range of guests discussing this throughout the morning. Joining us live on the ground in Paris all morning, Allianz chief economist Ludovic Subram is coming up at 8:30 CET. You can stay up to date with all the latest developments following Sunday's shock vote online at cnbc.com.
Now, coming up on the show, the calm before the storm. The euro trading near the flat line against the dollar after Sunday's bombshell election result. We'll bring you the latest throughout this morning. Stay tuned.
Listen to CNBC's Beyond the Valley, the podcast that explores the biggest tech news from across the globe. Join me, Arjun Karpal.
And me, Tom Chitty, every week as we bring you insights into the top stories, unpack the latest trends, and find out where the industry is headed.
Now available on Spotify, Apple Music, and Google Podcasts.
Well, we've certainly been focusing in on these French elections and really just what happens to the euro from here. All that volatility and political stability will be ones to look out for. 108.24 is pretty much where you're at right now for that one. Slipping after those projections, of course, pointed towards that hung parliament. Fresh uncertainty. Unexpectedly strong showing for the left-wing alliance. Of course, what does this all mean then for the markets, and where do we see euro dollar headed? Sylvia joining us for a little bit more on this conversation. It's going to be all eyes on the markets this morning, Sylvia.
Absolutely, because this is a very interesting outcome, and the traders this morning will be trying to understand what the outcome ultimately will mean for the fiscal position of France. Now, I'm pleased to say that I have with me François Digard, head of French equity research at Kepler Cheuvreux. Good morning.
Good morning, Sylvia.
First and foremost, this result of the French election has been very surprising. It was not what the polls were suggesting going into the vote. Just explain to us, from a market perspective, how do you read this outcome?
You're right, Sylvia. It was a surprise by the side of the election, in the sense that, yes, the left wing is much more powerful than anticipated. But on the other hand, you have a hung parliament, as expected. So last week, the market has played this kind of hung government. It was just expected to be more right-wing, and at the end, it is left-wing. But the kind of no majority parliament we have is exactly what the market was expecting.
So what sort of reaction should we expect when markets open? Because, yes, to some extent, the hung parliament option was priced in, fair. But then the fact that we are seeing a move toward the left, that raises concerns about spending plans, deficits, and so on. What is likely to be the reaction this morning?
We believe that the reaction is going to be negative, both on the indexes than on the spread as well, that is supposed to widen. Maybe to go back where it was 10 days ago, you know that last week we had a kind of a short rally both on the CAC 40, which was up something like 2.4%, on the small and mid-cap, French small and mid-caps, which have been the stocks that have been the most hit by the decision of Mr. Macron to dissolve the parliament. So these stocks were up 4.5% last week. So it is likely that this week we have the opposite movement to go back where we were 10 days ago when the uncertainties were at the maximum.
So tell us about the banking sector as a whole, because we saw a significant amount of pressure on French banks in the wake of the snap election. Ultimately, is this outcome also a deteriorating outlook for the French banks?
It is actually, from the market perspective, obviously it raised some concerns, some risk, but our analysts at Kepler Cheuvreux have deeply analyzed the balance sheet of these banks, and clearly they have a lot of room to absorb any kind of risk. So even if the market doesn't like the result by themselves, the soundness, the solidity of these banks are not questioned at all. So we believe that even if they have rallied as well in the past week, and since, at the first week after the dissolution, they were down severely, then they recovered. So it is likely that today, on the days to come, they go down again. But it doesn't jeopardize at all their solidity.
However, though, the earnings outlook is likely to be deteriorated by the fact that the ECB is on track to cut rates further throughout the year. On top of that, the fact that you have a weaker fiscal position is also going to put pressure on the banks themselves. Ultimately, though, can you actually say that even though they are in a solid position, is the outlook a positive one for the French lenders?
No, the outlook is not positive in the sense that, yes, the spreads are going to widen. However, what we think is that if the markets react too severely, it could be a buying opportunity, because ultimately where we are just in the position like all other European countries with own parliament. So France is no longer an exception in Europe. We are just like German, Dutch, Spanish, Italian. So it's just very specific very new for French to find this kind of coalition. And it is true that our political culture is not used to that. It will maybe take some time, but at the end, it's just democracy. And we think we will go through that.
Tell us about other French sectors. Looking at the equity space, naturally, in the wake of this result, which sectors stand out to you? Which ones are likely to actually either profit or lose, really, from the outcome of moving toward the left?
It's difficult to find any winner of the change. However, and I mentioned the fact that the smaller mid-caps are likely to be under pressure this week. But it's true that when you look at some sector, I think about the media, that has been extremely hammered in the past weeks because they were targeted by the National Rally that had a plan to privatize the public sector in France, the media public sector in France. So maybe you can find a relief on these names. And when you look at the other sectors, it is true that the ones that have suffered, like real estate, banks, and everything, will continue to suffer a bit. But when you look at the real estate, for instance, you realize that they are more linked to their corporate bonds than actually the government bonds. So maybe after a period of shock, the relief could come. So we think that Friday, I would have to tell you, okay, the market is going to react positively to this young parliament. Today, we have the surprise, so we realize that it's going to be complex to find a coalition. So the market, being surprised, doesn't like it, and just don't know what is going to happen.
Right.
And in the coming days, things will stabilize, and then it will time to come back.
Now, the key question mark at this stage is who is going to be the next prime minister and whether that person is actually going to manage to get some sort of, support at the National Assembly. What is the worst possible outcome at this stage when you are waiting to hear who's going to be the next prime minister for the markets?
It's the $1 million question, who is going to be the next prime minister. As you know, Mr. Macron is not well known to decide quickly when he has to nominate people, so we may have a couple of days to wait for that. And I think the market will appreciate a kind of technical profile, some expert government style, which is a likely outcome, and then would be appreciated by the market. If he goes in the left-wing direction, that could be more questioning for the markets on the short term.
Let's see what's going to happen. Now it remains to be seen what President Macron is going to say. But thank you so much for your time this morning. François Desgard, Head of French Equity Research at Kepler Cheuvreux there. And on that note, I'll hand it back to you in the studio. But we'll be tracking all the market action throughout this morning from the trading floor of Kepler Cheuvreux.
Thank you for listening to Squawk Box Europe Express.
For more market-moving news, you can head to cnbc.com.
Or join us again on the show with Steve Sedgwick, Karen Cho, and myself, Arabi Lekumete, weekdays on CNBC.